They took everything and called it family, my home, my savings, my trust, and when I was finally broken, they smiled. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Emily Carter. For most of my life, I believed that if you worked hard and loved honestly, life would meet you halfway. I wasn't rich, but I was careful. Every dollar I saved came from long hours, skipped vacations, and saying no when others said yes. I wanted stability, not luxury. When I met Daniel Reynolds, I thought I had found someone who understood that. He was calm, kind, and spoke about family like it was something sacred. He told me his parents raised him to value loyalty above all else. That word, loyalty, meant a lot to me. I grew up without much support, so the idea of being part of a close family felt like a blessing. His parents welcomed me with warm smiles and open arms. Sunday dinners, holiday traditions, and constant reminders that I was one of them now. I believed it. I wanted to believe it. For the first time, I felt safe enough to let my guard down. After we married, life seemed normal. Not perfect, but steady. I worked full-time, paid my share, and planned for the future. Daniel talked often about building something together, about trust being the foundation of marriage. When small financial decisions came up, he said we should think as one unit. That's what married couples do, right? His parents were always nearby, offering advice I didn't ask for but accepted anyway. They spoke with confidence, like people who knew better than me. Sometimes I felt small around them, but I told myself that was just insecurity. Families help each other. Families guide each other. There were moments that made me uncomfortable. Papers I didn't fully understand. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Gentle pressure disguised as concern. But every time doubt crept in, I pushed it away. I didn't want to be the suspicious wife. I didn't want to ruin peace with questions. I told myself love required trust, and trust required silence. What I didn't know was that while I was trying to fit in, something else was happening quietly. Decisions were being made without me. Plans were forming behind polite smiles. And every step I took closer to them was one step away from myself. I truly believed I was building a future with people who cared about me. I believed the word family meant protection, not ownership. I believed that no one who hugged you, prayed with you, and ate at your table could ever be planning to take from you. I was wrong. At that point, I didn't know how wrong. I only knew that something felt off, like the ground under my feet wasn't as solid as I thought. I had no idea that everything I trusted was already slipping away, and that the people I trusted most were the ones holding the knife. After the wedding, Daniel became even more attentive. He checked on me constantly, asked if I'd eaten, if I was tired, if work was stressing me out. He liked to say his job was to protect me. At first, it felt comforting. I had never had someone take that role so seriously. His parents, Margaret and Thomas Reynolds, stayed closely involved in our lives. They called often, visited without much notice, and always framed it as care. Margaret liked to remind me that marriage meant blending everything, habits, routines, and money. Thomas spoke less, but when he did, it carried weight. He had a way of sounding wise and final at the same time. The first small change came when Daniel suggested we open a shared account. He said it would make bills easier and show we trusted each other fully. I hesitated, but he smiled and asked why I was worried. He said married couples didn't keep score. I didn't want to seem difficult, so I agreed. Not long after that, his parents offered help. They said they had experience managing finances and could guide us so we wouldn't make mistakes. Margaret explained it like a favor, something loving parents did for their children. She used words like security and long-term planning. Daniel backed her up, telling me how lucky we were to have them. Little by little, decisions stopped feeling like mine. If I questioned something, Daniel would squeeze my hand and say his parents only wanted what was best for us. If I pushed back, Margaret would look hurt and say she thought of me like a daughter. That always stopped me. I didn't want to create tension over money. There were moments that didn't sit right. Daniel started asking me to transfer funds instead of paying directly. He said it helped him keep things organized. Sometimes money moved without him explaining why. When I asked, he'd say he'd already discussed it with his parents and it was handled. I noticed how often Margaret brought up sacrifice. She said strong marriages survived because one person was willing to give more when needed. She always said it while looking at me. Thomas would nod, adding that trust was proven through action, not words. Once, I mentioned keeping a separate account just for emergencies. The room went quiet. Daniel laughed it off, but his parents exchanged looks. Later that night, Daniel told me his parents felt I didn't fully trust the family. He asked why I was putting distance between us. I ended up apologizing, even though I wasn't sure what I'd done wrong. I told myself this was normal. Families had different ways. I was new, and they had years of experience. Keeping peace felt more important than being right. Every time doubt showed up, I buried it under the belief that love meant compromise. I didn't realize then that every compromise pushed the line a little farther. What felt like small red flags were actually quiet warnings. But I ignored them, because facing them meant admitting that the family I wanted so badly might not be what they claimed to be. Everything changed when Daniel lost his job. He came home quiet that day, holding a cardboard box with his things inside. I could see the fear in his eyes, and my first instinct was to reassure him. I told him we would get through it together. I meant it. For the first few weeks, I covered most of the expenses without complaint. I had savings set aside for emergencies, and this felt like one. Daniel said it was only temporary, that he'd find work soon. His parents became more involved than ever. They called daily, asking questions about bills, rent, and plans. They spoke with urgency, like the situation could fall apart at any second. Margaret suggested we simplify things by fully combining finances. She said it would reduce stress and help them support us properly. Thomas added that families pull resources together during hard times. Daniel agreed immediately. He said this was the moment to prove we were united. They framed it as a short-term solution. Just until Daniel was back on his feet. Just until things were stable again. I didn't like the idea, but I didn't want Daniel to feel like a failure or think I didn't trust him. So I agreed. What started as shared access slowly turned into shared control. I was asked to move my savings into a central account so bills could be managed easily. Then my inheritance came up. Margaret said letting it sit unused was wasteful when it could help the family now. She spoke gently, reminding me that money was meant to serve people, not sit untouched. The paperwork came next. Daniel said some documents needed updating to avoid confusion if something happened to either of us. He told me it was standard, that his parents had handled similar things before. I skimmed where I should have read. I signed where he pointed. Each time, he thanked me for being understanding. Months passed, and Daniel still hadn't found steady work. Every time I asked about our finances, I was told everything was under control. Margaret said I worried too much. Thomas said stress could damage a marriage. Daniel asked me to trust him just a little longer. One afternoon, I tried to access an account I thought was mine. I couldn't. I assumed it was a technical issue. When I asked Daniel, he said his parents had reorganized things for better management. He said it like it was no big deal. That night, I sat alone and added things up. I went through old documents, emails, and statements. My name was missing from places it used to be. Accounts I opened were no longer fully mine. Even the house paperwork didn't look the way I remembered. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I realized I had been giving and giving, believing sacrifice was proof of love. But somewhere along the way, I had crossed a line I didn't know existed. I wasn't just helping my family anymore. I was slowly disappearing from my own life. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind that should have meant nothing. I came home earlier than usual because work had been slow. The house was quiet, but I could hear voices coming from the living room. Daniel's voice. His parents' voices. I wasn't trying to listen. I was just walking down the hallway when I heard my name. I stopped without thinking. Margaret was speaking in a low, confident tone. She said things were finally settling the way they planned. Thomas replied that it took patience, but it was worth it. Then Daniel laughed. Not nervous. Not unsure. Comfortable. Margaret said she never questioned it. I told you she wouldn't. Daniel answered she wanted a family. That made it easy. My chest tightened. I stood frozen, my heart pounding so loud I was afraid they would hear it. Thomas said the money issue was solved now, that the pressure was off. He mentioned how smart it was to make everything legal early, before emotions got messy. Margaret added that once things were secure, there would be no risk of losing control. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Daniel said she was never meant to be part of the family business. She was the fix. I felt sick. They talked about me like I wasn't a person. Like I was a tool that had done its job. They discussed timelines, next steps, and how relieved they were that everything was now in the right hands. No guilt. No hesitation. Just satisfaction. I realized then that nothing had happened by accident. Every suggestion, every push, every moment I had been made to feel difficult for asking questions, it was all planned. I wasn't unlucky. I was chosen. I stepped back quietly and went to the bedroom. I closed the door without a sound and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. My hands were shaking. I wanted to scream. I wanted to confront them. I wanted to run. But I didn't do any of those things. That night, I walked back into the living room with a calm face. I smiled. I asked if anyone wanted dinner. Daniel looked at me with the same familiar expression, the one I had trusted for so long. His parents smiled too. Warm. Polite. Proud. I played my part perfectly. Inside, something had broken, but something else had woken up. I understood now that speaking in that moment would only make things worse. They had the power. They had the story. And they would crush me if I moved the wrong way. So I stayed quiet. I listened more. I watched closely. I remembered everything. Every word. Every look. Every careless comment they made when they thought I was still blind. They believed I was still theirs to manage. They had no idea that silence wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of something they never saw coming. After that night, the house felt different. The smiles were still there, but they didn't reach the eyes. Every small issue somehow became my fault. If a bill was late, it was because I was careless. If Daniel was stressed, it was because I wasn't supportive enough. Even silence was used against me. They said I was distant, cold, ungrateful. Arguments started over nothing. A comment about groceries turned into a lecture about responsibility. A simple question became proof that I didn't trust them. Daniel always took his parents' side. He said they were only trying to help and that I was creating tension for no reason. Margaret spoke to me softly, but her words were sharp. She said I had changed. She said the house didn't feel peaceful anymore. Thomas said stress was bad for Daniel and that I needed to think about his future. Every conversation ended the same way, with me feeling guilty and confused. Daniel started staying out late. When I asked where he was, he accused me of controlling him. When I stopped asking, he said I didn't care anymore. No matter what I did, it was wrong. Slowly, I stopped defending myself. It felt pointless. One evening, Daniel sat me down and said we needed space. He claimed it was temporary, just until things cooled off. Margaret nodded in agreement. She said sometimes distance helped people remember what mattered. Thomas added that it was for the good of the family. They suggested I stay somewhere else for a while. Just a few weeks. Daniel said the house was under too much pressure and that my presence made things harder. I looked around the room, waiting for someone to say this was unfair. No one did. I packed a suitcase that night. I stood in the bedroom, surrounded by things I thought were mine, and realized how little I could actually take. Documents weren't in my name. Accounts weren't mine to access. Even the house keys felt like they didn't belong to me anymore. Daniel watched as I zipped the suitcase. He didn't offer to help. He didn't ask when I'd be back. He said this was best for everyone. His parents hugged me and told me to take care of myself. Their voices were calm, almost relieved. I walked out with one bag and nowhere certain to go. Days turned into weeks. When I asked about coming back, Daniel said things were still tense. Margaret said I should focus on myself. Thomas said rushing would only cause more damage. The message was clear without being said. The house was no longer mine. The money was gone. The life I thought I had was over. And they still called it family. They said this was necessary. They said it was fair. They said it was love. But all I could see was that I had been pushed out quietly, stripped of everything, and left to figure out survival on my own, while they stayed comfortable, secure, and untouched. The first night in my small rented room, I couldn't sleep. The walls were bare, the bed thin, and the air smelled faintly of cleaning products. I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at my hands, trying to make sense of everything. Shame weighed heavy on me. How had I let this happen? How had I trusted the people I thought loved me the most? Grief followed quickly. I missed my home, the little routines that had made life feel normal, even if I had been blind to the cracks. I missed the comfort of my own space, the security I had taken for granted. Every memory now carried the sting of betrayal. I kept replaying conversations, arguments, and decisions, asking myself over and over where I had gone wrong. Anger came next. Hot, sharp, and consuming. At first, it made me restless. I wanted to call them, to shout, to demand justice immediately. But the anger faded into a quiet, simmering determination. I realized yelling or confronting them now wouldn't help. They had carefully built a situation where I had no power. I needed a plan. The next day, I started gathering everything I could. Bank statements. Old checks. Emails. Documents I had signed. Anything that showed what had been moved, shared, or taken from me. I went through each piece slowly, carefully, like peeling back layers of a long-forgotten truth. As I documented, a realization hit me. I had been legally manipulated. Every temporary transfer, every signature I thought was routine, every suggestion that it was for the good of the family, they had used it against me. They had built their control step by step, knowing I would never question it. And now, for the first time, I could see it clearly. It wasn't just betrayal, it was strategy. Sitting in that small room, I made a decision. I wouldn't let this break me. I wouldn't cry endlessly over what I had lost. Instead, I would use this knowledge, these papers, and this clarity as my tool. I began organizing everything into a record of facts, a record of deceit, and a record of my own rights. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope. I wasn't powerless. I had the proof. I had the truth. And with that, I realized I could fight back. Not with anger or shouting, but with patience, strategy, and precision. Rock bottom wasn't the end. It was the beginning of everything I needed to reclaim. For the first time, I felt ready. After organizing all my records, I knew I couldn't rush. The Reynolds family thought I was broken, tired, and beaten. They believed I had no power, that I had nowhere to turn. I decided to let them think that. I smiled when I had to, kept my voice soft, and acted like life had gone on without me. Inside, I was anything but defeated. I started working longer hours at my job, taking every shift I could manage. Money wasn't the goal, it was independence. I needed to prove to myself first that I could stand on my own. I saved every extra dollar, carefully building a small reserve that would give me options. Every time I felt exhausted, I reminded myself that this was preparation, not punishment. At the same time, I worked on rebuilding my credit. I opened accounts in my own name, made payments on time, and slowly improved my financial standing. It was tedious, and it took patience, but I understood that every small step added strength. If I wanted to reclaim what had been taken, I needed to be solid, unshakable, and untouchable. I also reached out quietly to a professional, someone who could guide me legally. I explained everything, showed the documents, and listened carefully to the options. For the first time, I felt like there was a path forward. Not a path fueled by anger, but one built on strategy. Every step, every decision, had to be deliberate. While I worked, I kept my life simple. I stayed in my small rented room, avoided contact with the Reynolds family, and let rumors about me fade. They assumed I had given up, that I had accepted their version of family peace. I let them believe it. Every smile I gave when we crossed paths, every polite response, was part of the plan. I was silent, but I was preparing. I thought about the house, the money, the security I had lost. I didn't dwell on bitterness, though. Bitterness was heavy and useless. Instead, I focused on what I could control: my work, my finances, my knowledge, my patience. Every day I grew stronger, more confident, and more aware. The key was patience. I knew that rushing would only give them an advantage. They had planned carefully, so I had to prepare carefully. Every signature, every document, every conversation I had saved became a tool I could use when the time came. By the time I was ready, I would not need to yell, threaten, or beg. I would have everything in place. And when that day came, they would see that the quiet, seemingly powerless wife they thought they had defeated was the very one taking back control. I had learned that true power doesn't come from noise. It comes from preparation, patience, and persistence. And I was ready. The day it all came out felt surreal. I had spent months preparing quietly, and now the moment had arrived where the truth could no longer be hidden. With the help of the professional I had consulted, I filed the necessary documents and sent everything through the proper legal channels. Every bank statement, every transfer, every signature I had collected became evidence. There was no way they could deny it. At first, nothing seemed to change. I kept my routine, going to work and returning to my rented room. I waited. Then, slowly, the calls started. My lawyer informed me that the Reynolds family had received the notices. The calm, confident image they had maintained for years began to crack immediately. Daniel called once, panicked and pleading. He tried to sound casual at first, but his voice trembled. He asked questions about the documents, the process, and the next steps. I stayed quiet, letting him know only what was necessary. I had no intention of explaining or negotiating without the legal framework protecting me. Margaret and Thomas were even worse. They reached out, sending polite letters at first, pretending concern. But as days passed, their tone changed. The confidence they once displayed in every interaction was gone. Behind closed doors, I could sense them scrambling. They realized the carefully maintained family image that everyone admired was about to collapse completely. Friends, neighbors, and even distant relatives who once saw them as flawless began to ask questions. Rumors started spreading, but this time it wasn't my doing, it was the truth leaking through official channels. For the first time, they weren't in control of the story. Daniel tried to negotiate privately, offering promises he had no intention of keeping. I listened but didn't respond beyond what was required legally. I had learned patience and restraint. The evidence spoke louder than any apology or excuse could. Every paper I had saved, every detail I had documented, was now forcing the Reynolds family to face the reality they had created. There was no hiding. There was no manipulation strong enough to erase the facts. For the first time in years, I felt the weight on my chest lift. The fear, the uncertainty, the helplessness, it all started to fade. I had taken control, not through anger or revenge, but through preparation and truth. Watching them panic quietly, seeing the cracks form in their polished facade, was both satisfying and sobering. They had underestimated me at every turn. They had thought silence meant weakness. But now, the reality of their actions was unavoidable. The truth had come due, and for the first time, justice wasn't just an idea. It was real, undeniable, and right in front of them. Everything they had stolen was now accounted for, and they couldn't hide from it. I finally realized, this was not about punishment. It was about balance. The scales had tipped, and the Reynolds family was facing the consequences of their own choices. When everything was finally resolved legally, I felt a strange mix of relief and strength. I had regained what was mine, my money, my home, and the security that had been stolen, but the true victory was something they could never take away, my voice. For years, I had been silenced, manipulated, and pushed around. Now, I could speak freely, make my own decisions, and set boundaries without fear. Daniel and his parents were no longer in control. Their polished image had crumbled. People who once admired them questioned their actions, and their authority over family matters had vanished. Margaret and Thomas tried to maintain appearances, but their confidence was gone. Daniel, who had once seemed untouchable, looked small and panicked. Everything they had relied on, the trust, the loyalty, the fear I would stay silent, had evaporated. I received messages from neighbors, friends, and even distant relatives who had always respected the Reynolds family. Many were surprised, some shocked, and a few angry that I had been treated this way. Their opinion mattered far less than the fact that I had control over my own life now. The family's grip on reputation was gone, and I realized that no apology or explanation from them could repair the damage they had done, to me or to themselves. I refused to reconcile. I didn't need an apology to prove my worth. I didn't need their acceptance to validate my life. Walking away with dignity, while they struggled to explain their own actions to the world, was more powerful than anything they could offer. I had learned that respect for myself mattered more than family titles or forced harmony. The house was mine again. The accounts were in my name. The documents, the papers, everything that had once belonged to them in my world had been returned. But I also gained independence, confidence, and clarity. I could make plans, take risks, and build a life without fear of betrayal. I could finally trust myself again. In the quiet moments, I reflected on the journey. Every step, from the small rented room to the long hours of preparation, had taught me patience and strategy. The family who had called themselves mine had underestimated me, and their failure was complete. They had tried to erase me, but I had reclaimed not only my possessions but also my dignity and strength. I learned that revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, deliberate, and complete. Taking back what was stolen is just the start. True victory is reclaiming your life, your voice, and your confidence, and never letting anyone convince you that you are less than you deserve. For the first time in years, I felt free, whole, and unshakable. The Reynolds family had lost control, and I had gained everything that truly mattered. Once I had regained everything, I knew my life needed a fresh start. I didn't want to live in the shadow of the people who had hurt me, or let their betrayal define me. I rented a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood and slowly filled it with things that made me happy, my favorite books, a few photographs, and little comforts that reminded me who I was. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I focused on myself. I worked hard, not because I had to, but because I wanted to build a life that was fully mine. I explored new hobbies, reconnected with old friends, and learned to trust my instincts again. Each day, I felt stronger, more capable, and more certain that I didn't need anyone else to validate my worth. Daniel, Margaret, and Thomas faded from my daily thoughts. I didn't seek revenge in the form of confrontation or destruction, that wasn't my goal. Instead, I watched quietly as their reputation suffered in subtle ways. People began to question their stories, their credibility, and their actions. The control they had clung to for years was gone. I had taken back my life without being loud or vindictive, and it was far more satisfying than any argument or fight could have been. I realized that real revenge isn't about hurting others, it's about reclaiming yourself. It's about understanding your own worth and refusing to beg for a seat at a table that once stole everything from you. I didn't need their approval or forgiveness. I didn't need to explain myself to them. I was free, and that freedom felt like victory. I learned to celebrate small victories. Every bill I paid myself, every decision I made without fear, every moment I felt proud of who I had become reminded me that I was no longer a victim. The past was a lesson, not a weight. I kept my records, my memories, and the knowledge of what had happened, but I didn't carry bitterness. Instead, I carried strength, independence, and clarity. Life continued, and I grew in ways I never imagined. I made choices based on my happiness, my goals, and my values. No one could manipulate me again, no one could threaten my peace, and no one could convince me to compromise my dignity. I was finally in control of my own story. Looking back, I understood that walking away stronger was the ultimate form of justice. The family who had called betrayal family was left with regret and lost influence, while I walked confidently into a future I had built myself. I didn't need to fight with them, I only needed to live fully, independently, and with pride. And that, I realized, was more powerful than anything they had ever taken from me.